Amigos e amigas de CartaCapital, sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Eu sou o Leonardo Miaso. Hoje terei o prazer de entrevistar a doutora Marina Nord, do Instituto V-Dem, da Universidade de Gotemburgo, na Suécia. Todos os anos, esse instituto publica o Democracy Report, um grande estudo sobre a saúde da democracia ao redor do mundo. São dados referentes a 202 países e territórios, abrangendo o período de 1789 a 2025. Envolve mais de 4.200 pesquisadores e outros especialistas para mesurar mais de 600 atributos das democracias. Na edição de 2026, o Instituto aponta que, para o cidadão médio, o nível de democracia retrocedeu a estágios de 1978. As conquistas da chamada terceira onda de democratização foram praticamente anuladas. Os Estados Unidos perderam seu histórico status de democracia liberal. Mas o Brasil, após as ameaças sob Jair Bolsonaro, conseguiu reverter um processo de autocratização. É sobre estes e outros temas que converso a partir de agora com Marina Nord. A entrevista será em inglês, com legendas em português. Welcome, Dr. Marina Nord. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Doctor, the report states that democracy for the average global citizen has regressed to 1978 levels, erasing nearly all the gains of the third wave of democratization. But in practical terms, what does it signify for the fundamental rights of people living under these regimes today?
Well, if you look at the average for the global citizen, as you correctly said, we are back to 1978. And that means that from the perspective of an average global citizen, almost all gains of the third wave of democratization have been eradicated. In Democracy Report, we use four different measures to measure the average level of democracy in the world, and you see a different decline. So, democracy in the world declines on all four measures, but you see the different magnitude of decline on different measures. And the reason for that is that autocratization in the world is now mostly driven by countries that are large, populous, and economically powerful. So if you look by country averages, we are back to 1995. By population weighted averages, from the perspective of an average citizen, we are back to 1978. By territory weighted averages, we are back to 1989. And then by by GDP averages, we are at its lowest point in more than 50 years. And that means that democracy in the world is losing quite a lot also in terms of economic power.
And for the first time in over 50 years, the United States have lost its status as a liberal democracy and are now classified as an electoral democracy. Why did this happen, and what are the dangers involved, not just for the United States, but globally?
Well, yes, as you correctly said, the aggregate decline on the liberal democracy index for the democracy level in the United States is insane. So the level of democracy in the United States is back to 1965, and for those of you who don't know, it's a very symbolic year for the American history because 1965 is the year of the Voting Rights Act. As any political scientist will tell you, this is the year when the United States became a true democracy. Because before that, if parts of your population doesn't have voting rights, then the country cannot be considered a democracy. So the fact that the United States loses the status of liberal democracy is also very indicative. It means that the decline on the aggregate index is mostly driven by decline in checks and balances. So the extent to which the executive is now constrained by the legislative and by the judicial branches. So the decline in the United States is driven mostly by the decline in the checks and balances, but also in freedom of expression and civil rights and equality before the law. And just to as to your second question, why it's so significant for the world is there are several reasons. I mean, first of all, it's signaling effects, of course, for the rest of the world. If this can happen in the United States, that can happen in any country in the world. So, if the United States does not care anymore about fundamental democratic rights and principles, why should other countries care? And then the second thing is that is a very direct effects also with the dismantling of USAID, for example. And just if you look at the data alone, in 2024, when USAID was still functioning, the United States was was spending 2.6 billion US dollars every year for democratic rights and freedoms, also for development. And just for comparison, the second largest donor in the world was the European Union, and that was only slightly above 400 million. So it's 15% of what the United States was spending. So it's also very tangible effects for the rest of the world, for countries that were depending on the support coming from the United States. And then, of course, it's also the spread of autocratic norms through the international organizations, because the United States is, of course, one of major players. And what we see now in the world is that this global balance of power is shifting. It's, of course, not only because of the United States, but with the United States, it's also one very symbolic move that's happening.
And another very disturbing data point in the report is that torture appears for the first time among the indicators registering the most widespread decline, used in 33 countries to suppress political opposition. Are we seeing a return to more brutal forms of state repression compared to previous decades?
Well, in some countries, yes. I wouldn't speak for every country in the world, but that's a very symbolic also thing that we haven't seen torture among the top 20 declining indicators during the last years in the democracy report. Um, which specific countries there are, you should go into details. So it's always devil in the details. So it's mostly countries that were already autocratic, electoral autocracies that are becoming a lot more autocratic. So, but again, it's something very very new, and I think it's something that means quite a lot for the rest of the world that these things are happening.
Dr. Nord, Democracy Report indicates that the process of autocratization in Brazil began with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016 and accelerated with the election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. Then, 4 years later, Lula won the election with a broad coalition of parties, and Brazil is highlighted as a primary example of a U turn, having halted and reversed a process of autocratization. So, how relevant was that, and how can this serve as an example for other countries trying to deal with their own threats to democracy?
Yeah, I mean, Brazil was a very significant example, of course. First of all, because it was a very powerful move towards against autocratization. It's one of the very few countries that managed to protect democracy before it breaks down. And again, from the research perspective, it's a very symbolic because we looked at the data for the last 125 years, and in countries, in democracies where this process of autocratization happens, usually only 20% of those countries survive as democracies. So for 80%, democracy breaks down at least for a short period of time. So Brazil was among those 20% unique examples where democracy survived autocratization and where institutions, most notably the judiciary, of course, eventually stood up and protected the constitution and protected democracy. So for the second, it was also a very powerful example for the rest of the world because Brazil is a very important, powerful, economically powerful actor in the world affairs. And it also shows us how autocratization can be halted. So again, if you look at data, Brazil is one of those examples where you can, from which you can learn for other countries. So, for example, in terms of which specific factors contribute to halting and reversing autocratization. First of all, the institutional safeguards. So the judiciary, as I have already mentioned, that eventually stand up and protect the constitution, do not allow executive aggrandizement, do not allow going against the law or any illegal power grab, as it was in case with Bolsonaro when he tried to undermine the elections. Then it's of course elections and how Brazil managed to protect the quality of elections and how many organizations, including civil society organizations, but also electoral management body, how they were fighting for protecting um, elections from disinformation that was around election campaign. And then, of course, societal actions. So civil society organizations that were helping to protect again the integrity of elections, fighting disinformation, fact checking campaigns, and pro democracy mass mobilization and unified opposition. So it's something that was very important in previous elections where a coalition of parties united against Bolsonaro and against an attempt to undermine democracy in Brazil. So we can learn quite a lot from Brazilian case. It's one of the prime examples for the last years of where our democracy was protected.
And at the same time, Doctor, the report warns that Brazilian society remains deeply polarized. Does it affect the quality of democracy in the long run, even as institutional indicators show some recovery?
Yes, of course, because as we know again from research, is polarization, extreme polarization is one of the main dangers for democracy. So polarization is one of the main in countries where society is highly polarized, and like Brazil is one example. The United States is another example that we discussed today. Where you have high level of polarization, it happens quite often that political opponents start to talk about each other as enemies of who we are, enemies of that need to be destroyed. So at that moment, when it comes to this toxic level of polarization, um, democracy is something that many political parties are willing to sacrifice in order to win elections, and that's also for Brazil is I think is the main danger that the Brazilian society now faces because we see the son of Bolsonaro is now running for elections, and that's something that um, those who try to undermine democracy, they can use this high level of polarization in order to grab power and in order to drive autocratization through that. And again, in a certain way, the second Trump term in office is also an example of how it can happen because polarization was high under the first Trump presidency, but then again, it was never resolved, and it helped Trump to gain power for the second time. So that's, I think, one of the danger for Brazilian democracy nowadays as well, because as long as you don't resolve this problem, you cannot move forward. You cannot protect democracy.
Yeah, for instance, the document states that 2026 elections will be decisive for the future of Brazil. So that's something we should pay attention to. And while Brazil shows signs of democratic improvement, major regional neighbors like Argentina and Mexico are entering episodes of autocratization, according to Democracy Report. What is the potential impact on Latin America, and how can the region's general situation be classified nowadays?
Well, autocratization is a global trend. So if you look at how many countries in the world were affected during the last 25 years, it was in total 85 countries. 85, and then just for perspective, it's 57% of world population and 53% of world GDP. So it's half of the world. At some point, some countries were affected earlier, like Venezuela or Russia. Some countries are affected only now, like the United States. But this trend has been going on for 25 years. And in this regard, we cannot say that Latin America is in any way like more affected than any other region in the world. So it's a global trend. And then, of course, it has, local touch in a certain way. For example, Mexico is a very unique and odd case of autocratization because it's driven by left government, left party. So it's something that is very unusual for the third wave of autocratization. Argentina is a more typical case of autocratization where it's driven by right-wing populist leader, who is trying to dismantle democracy in a very um, typical for the third wave of autocratization path. But then again, of course, it larger countries like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, they matter a lot more than smaller countries in the world, and it's also for the region.
Just one last question, Doctor. The case of Zambia is used in the report to illustrate how fragile U turns can be as the country has quickly regressed into an electoral autocracy again. So, what differentiates a solid democratic recovery from one that is at high risk of failing within a few years?
So what we know for sure from the academic perspective that once you enter a process of autocratization, even if you recover, you are still very fragile, at least for some period of time. Usually because, as I have already said, you have high level of polarization, some problems that brought auto and started autocratization to begin with, they are still there, they were not solved. It's, for example, high inequality in the society, some economic problems, high corruption. Even if a pro-democratic party comes to power and wins elections, it still takes time to resolve. And if the problems that were there were not resolved, then of course there is always a risk for another power grab and dismantling of democracy. And then Zambia is one of those cases where we saw this happening. So there is still pro-democratic movement. So we are still not losing hope for Zambia. It's an ongoing process, but it's very very fragile because problems that caused this autocratization in the first place, they were not resolved. It's the same story also eventually for Poland, where we still have this legacy from the Law and Justice Party, like the judicial reform that they and their time introduced. That still the judiciary is not functioning perfectly. It's still again high level of polarization in Brazil and in many many other countries.
Thank you very much for the interview, Dr. Nord. See you next time.
Thank you.
E se você gostou desta entrevista, não se esqueça de deixar o seu like neste vídeo, de se inscrever no canal de Carta Capital no YouTube e de acessar sempre o www.cartacapital.com.br. Um grande abraço a todos e até a próxima.